They said she was stealing, that the waitress was pocketing money behind everyone's back. But what the undercover black CEO discovered that morning in his own restaurant was not a thief hiding among the workers. It was a system stealing from the very people who gave it life. And when he saw a young woman quietly wipe her eyes between serving tables, then realized that 70% of the tips had been funneled to a manager's nephew who barely lifted a tray, the truth hit him harder than any balance sheet ever could. Because in that moment he understood his company was not just losing money, it was losing its soul. Before I continue, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe and give this video a like so this story can reach more people who need to hear it. Now, here is how it began. David Carter was 52 years old, the founder and CEO of Harbor Eats, a national chain of diners with more than 120 locations, and Harbor Point Diner number 47 in Baltimore. Maryland was supposed to be just another thriving branch, but reports troubled him. Turnover had soared to 42%, the highest in the company. Staff surveys placed engagement dead last, yet revenue was steady, even rising, and David knew those numbers didn't add up. Something was broken inside the walls, something that glossy reports could not capture. That is why, on a misty October morning, he sat inside a weathered pickup truck across the street, wearing not a tailored suit, but a faded gray shirt with a stitched name tag that read, James W., an old jacket, and the calm expression of a man who had nothing to prove, because he wanted to watch unnoticed, to see the truth with his own eyes. When he pushed open the diner door, the bell jingled faintly, but no one looked up. No one greeted him. The air was flat, the energy heavy, and he slid into a corner booth without a sound. Minutes later, a young waitress approached, balancing a tray with the kind of grace that only came from repetition, her hair tied back neatly, apron clean but worn, eyes swollen as if she had been crying, and she set down a cup of black coffee with a single slice of toast, adding softly, almost apologetically, "I brought butter and jam just in case." Her name was Monica James, 29 years old, a single mother trying to hold on to a job that gave her little recognition. David smiled faintly, thanked her, then asked casually, "Busy morning? I imagine the tips make it worth it?" For half a second she froze. Her smile flickered, then returned, but her voice dropped as she admitted, "Morning tips aren't good. Only a few of us actually get them." Her tone was flat, not bitter, just exhausted, the kind of exhaustion that no paycheck could measure. David sipped his coffee, but the bitterness he tasted was not from the cup. It was from her words. He watched her move table to table, fast but deliberate, refilling mugs, clearing plates, calming impatient customers, carrying more weight than anyone else. While two young men stood by the register, arms folded, one of them tapping the POS screen with casual ownership, the other laughing quietly. David noticed immediately they were not working the floor, they were not serving, they were controlling the system. The younger one, Ethan Wallace, the nephew of the branch manager Rick Wallace, processed nearly every card payment, and with each swipe of a credit card, every digital tip disappeared from the hands that had earned it and into accounts set up by someone else. David pulled out a small notebook, scribbled quietly, "She works. He collects." When Monica returned to clear a plate, he asked softly, "Why don't you process the payments yourself?" She did not stop moving, but her voice dropped to a whisper. "I don't have access. They list me as supplemental staff, invisible. No access means no tips." David leaned in slightly. "Who decides that?" She tilted her head toward the counter, where Rick Wallace stood laughing with a customer, looking every bit the polished manager, shirt crisp, pen clipped neatly in his pocket. But beneath that surface charm lay something rotten. "He sets all the rolls," Monica whispered, "and Ethan always has full access. Then, in a move that would change everything, Monica reached into her apron and pulled out a small spiral notebook, edges bent, pages worn from use. She handed it to him discreetly. "I needed to know I wasn't crazy," she said softly. "So I wrote everything down inside." Page after page showed dates, table numbers, bill totals, tips displayed on the POS, and tips actually received. Red circles marked the gaps, margins filled with quick notes, timestamps scribbled in the corner. "In the past month alone, I lost more than $600, she whispered. "What hurts more than the money is that no one ever asked. Not once. Who decides? Or how?" David flipped carefully, then closed the notebook with respect, not finality. This was not just a record. It was evidence of a quiet injustice eating away at the company he had built. He slid the notebook back, covered the movement with his coffee cup, and said nothing. But inside, a storm gathered. He had told his managers years ago, "If you want to know whether a restaurant is healthy, watch how the staff pours coffee at 7 in the morning." And here, at 7 in the morning, he saw dignity drained from the very people who carried the weight. Across the room, Ethan blocked a new employee from logging into the POS, tapping quickly, locking her out, then smirking as if the power were his alone. David's pen scratched again. Nepotism, manipulation, theft disguised as structure. He knew then this was no misunderstanding, no oversight, but a deliberate design. And that morning, under the dull glow of a flickering neon sign, sipping coffee that had gone cold, David Carter, the man who had built Harbor Eats from nothing, realized his company was being used by a few to grind down the very workers it was meant to lift up. He left the diner hours later in silence, but silence did not mean peace, because in his mind, the first domino had already fallen, and the storm that began in that corner booth would soon sweep across the entire company, pulling Rick Wallace and his nephew into the light of accountability, and changing forever the way Harbor Eats treated the people who made it live. The morning rush grew heavier. Plates clattered. Coffee poured non-stop. Yet one truth became clearer with every passing minute. The people who worked the hardest were invisible, while those who stood idle controlled the flow of money. And David Carter sat quietly in the corner, watching as his suspicion turned into confirmation. Monica James moved like a shadow with purpose. Table after table, balancing trays, offering refills, guiding a nervous new hire named Angela Torres through the basics of the floor. But whenever Angela reached toward the POS terminal, Ethan Wallace stepped in with a smirk, tapping the screen before she could even try, locking her out with a flick of his finger, then handing back the check slip as if to remind everyone who truly owned the machine. And Angela, red in the face, whispered to Monica, "I don't understand. Yesterday I had access. Today it's gone." To which Monica replied with a calm bitterness, "Don't let him touch your entries. If he does, you'll never see your tips again," David wrote in his small notebook. Access revoked at will, control concentrated in one pair of hands. Then looked up again, scanning the room. Rick Wallace, the manager, leaned against the counter, laughing with a regular, looking every bit the part of a polished leader. But his presence was hollow. He supervised nothing. He checked nothing. And when a tray slipped from a trainee's hands, spilling orange juice across the floor, it was Monica who knelt to clean it. Not Rick, not Ethan, and certainly not Chase, the other young man by the register, who only muttered something about careless hands before folding his arms again. David's pen scratched again. Leadership absent, labor exploited. He sipped the last of his coffee, now lukewarm, and let his gaze follow Monica, who finally returned to his table with a faint sigh, whispering, "I shouldn't be saying this, but it doesn't matter what we do. The system is fixed. Tips aren't split fairly. Not by effort, not by hours, just by roles that Rick sets up. And Ethan is always marked as primary. David tilted his head, asked softly, "Has anyone complained?" Monica's face stiffened. She shook her head quickly, her eyes darting toward the counter. "People tried. They don't last. They get fewer shifts. Then they get pushed out. And eventually they quit. That's why almost half the staff has turned over this year. Anyone who questions the system disappears." David felt a heat rise in his chest, but kept his voice steady, asking, "How long has it been like this?" Monica leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice so no one else could hear. "At least 2 years. Maybe longer. It started small, a few missing tips here and there. But when Ethan got control of the POS, it all shifted. I wrote everything down so I wouldn't think I was crazy. They make it look like configuration, not theft, so no one questions it." David nodded, understanding that what she carried was not only evidence, but the emotional weight of fighting alone. He placed his hand briefly on the edge of the notebook she still carried in her apron and said quietly, "Keep writing. Don't stop. No matter what happens, your record matters." She looked at him strangely, not recognizing the man beneath the disguise, but sensing his words carried authority. Across the diner, Ethan laughed loudly at a customer who had tipped only $1 on a $10 meal, mocking the gesture, then sliding the digital receipt away with a flourish. David clenched his jaw, noting again, disrespect for customers, entitlement unchecked. The atmosphere in the diner was thick. Employees moved with resignation rather than energy, the air of survival rather than pride. Marcus Green, the head cook in the back, peeked out from the kitchen window briefly, his expression weary, his eyes following Ethan and Rick with quiet disgust. But he said nothing, only returned to his grill, flipping bacon as though silence was the only way to survive. David knew that look. He had seen it in other industries, in other men. The look of someone who had watched too much injustice to believe speaking up would change anything. He wrote again, "Silence not from agreement, but from exhaustion." The morning passed with a rhythm that was more mechanical than human. And David thought back to the words he had told his first group of managers almost 20 years earlier. A restaurant does not die because of slow sales. It dies when its people stop believing they matter. Here, in this Baltimore diner, he saw that death in motion, slow and deliberate, a suffocation disguised as order, at one point. Angela brought a tray of coffee refills toward table 12, her hands trembling slightly. But Ethan intercepted the check, entered it himself, and smirked as he tapped his access card against the POS. David watched her shoulders slump, and he felt his anger harden into resolve. He knew then this was bigger than one diner, bigger than one manager. Because if Rick had found a way to rig the system here, others would follow, and it could spread like a disease across the chain. He scribbled quickly. Fraud, systemic potential, network of access abuse. Monica passed by again, slipping him a whisper without slowing her pace. Be careful what you say around them. Rick doesn't like questions. And Ethan always finds a way to make people leave. David gave a small nod, his eyes calm, but his mind was already racing. He had seen enough for now, but not everything. The first cracks had appeared, not just in the numbers, but in the human faces before him. Monica with her quiet notebook, Angela with her restricted access, Marcus with his silent eyes from the kitchen, and behind them all, Rick Wallace standing tall as though nothing was wrong. David knew he needed more than instinct. He needed proof, hard data, something that could not be denied. He finished the last of his toast, placed his pen neatly in his pocket, and stood slowly, leaving a tip in cash on the table, watching as Monica's eyes flickered toward it, knowing full well she would never see the digital tips owed to her, but at least this one she could hold. He walked toward the door without another word. The bell above it chimed again. and he stepped back into the Baltimore mist. His mind no longer filled with questions, but with a plan. Because now he knew what he was fighting. And when he fought, he did not fight halfway. The storm was still quiet, but it was coming, and when it arrived, it would not leave a single secret standing. David Carter walked back into the mist of Baltimore that morning, the bell of the diner still echoing faintly in his ears. And as he stepped into his pickup truck, he sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel, staring straight ahead. The notebook entries of Monica James burned into his mind. Her quiet courage contrasted with the arrogance of Ethan Wallace at the register. And in that silence, David made a choice that would change everything. He reached into his pocket, pulled out an old phone reserved only for calls that mattered, and dialed a number he rarely used. The call lasted 93 seconds, but in those 93 seconds, a storm began. "Mara," he said, his voice steady, "we have a problem. The POS system is being manipulated. I need you to go in quiet, line by line, every role assignment, every account receiving tips, and do not alert the staff." Mara Lynn, head of internal investigations for Harbor Eats, had been with him 7 years. A woman who never asked unnecessary questions, who had dismantled 3 embezzlement rings without a single headline. And she simply replied, "Understood." By the time David turned the key in the ignition, the system at Harbor Point Diner number 47 had already been switched into silent audit mode. The screens in Baltimore looked normal. Customers paid, receipts printed, tips processed. But beneath the surface, a second record began to write itself, logging every override, every role change, every redirected transaction. David drove away without breakfast, the drizzle on his windshield blurring the neon sign behind him. But inside, he felt clarity sharp enough to cut steel. This was no longer suspicion. It was investigation. That afternoon, Mara sent the first update. Finding number 1, the POS system had been modified with a hidden access tier labeled Preferred Internal, a role invisible to the standard employee screen. That hidden tier had been assigned to 3 accounts: Rick Wallace, manager; Ethan Wallace, part-time server; and 1 more, a ghost account labeled Kitchen Support 03. Finding number 2, in the last 30 days. Total digital tips processed at the diner exceeded $9,600, but 68% of those tips had been routed through Ethan's account, even though ticket data proved he served less than 20% of total tables. Finding number 3. Payroll records listed a part-time kitchen worker named Marcus Hill, clocked in 21 out of the last 25 mornings, but HR had no onboarding file for Marcus Hill, no tax documentation, and the Social Security number attached to his ID had been flagged 2 years earlier in another branch during an unfinished investigation. Back then, the manager of that branch was Rick Wallace. David's jaw tightened as he read the report on his tablet. He knew what this meant. This wasn't favoritism. This wasn't sloppy management. This was systemic fraud disguised as configuration. Finding number 4 confirmed it. Finance traced weekly service logistics fees to a shell entity registered out of state, Douglas Henderson LLC, a company with no employees, no real office, and contact information tied to an old email address once used by Rick Wallace before his promotion. The amounts matched the missing tips almost dollar for dollar. David leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. The anger in him no longer wild, but cold, focused, a firebank of resolve. He thought of Monica, scribbling notes in secret just to prove she wasn't crazy. Thought of Angela being locked out of the system. Thought of Marcus Green in the kitchen holding his silence because speaking meant losing his job. He thought of every diner across the country where another Monica might be working invisible shifts while someone else skimmed what she earned. This wasn't one location. This was a cancer in the system, and it had to be cut out. He called Mara again. "Expand the audit," he said. "Check every branch Rick has managed. Check for ghost accounts, hidden roles, external payouts, Don't alert anyone. I want it clean before we move, Mara acknowledged, already building her team of data analysts and compliance officers, their screens lighting up with transactions from every Harbor Eats diner in the region. For 2 nights, David slept little, pacing his office in Baltimore, staring out at the harbor lights, remembering the years he spent building the company brick by brick, remembering the promise he had made to himself that Harbor Eats would never be just another corporation. It would be a place where the people who worked hardest would always be seen. Now that promise was under attack from within, and it was his responsibility to defend it. The next morning, Mara's second report arrived. Thicker, heavier, impossible to ignore. Hidden access tiers were not limited to Diner 47. They had appeared in 3 other locations, each one tied to either Rick directly or to one of his former assistants. Ghost employees had clocked in hundreds of hours across multiple sites, their phantom wages transferred to external entities. In total, more than $50,000 in stolen tips and wages had been funneled away in just the past quarter. David rubbed his temples, the weight of betrayal heavy, but not surprising. He had trusted the numbers too long, trusted managers who smiled on the surface, while beneath they hollowed out the values he had built. But betrayal, he reminded himself, only destroys if you let it stay hidden. Expose it, and betrayal becomes fuel for change. He walked to the window, the harbor quiet in the morning light, and whispered to himself, "No one erases my people." He thought of Monica again, her notebook, her tired eyes. Her whisper that hurt more than the money was that no one ever asked. He would ask. He would demand. And when he returned, it would not be as James W., the ordinary man in a gray shirt, but as David Carter, the founder and CEO, standing in front of everyone who thought they could rewrite the rules. Still, timing mattered. He couldn't strike too soon, couldn't let Rick know the storm was coming. He had to let the audit gather enough evidence to make denial impossible. So for 3 more days, the silent system recorded everything, every tip redirected, every override logged, every ghost employee clocked in. Customers ate their meals, staff carried trays. Ethan laughed at the register. Rick smiled with his polished charm. But the walls were closing in, and none of them knew. By Thursday evening, Mara called again. "We have everything," she said. "The graphs show distribution skewed to Ethan, the hidden roles, the ghost accounts, the external payouts, all linked to Rick. It's airtight." David nodded, his voice calm. "Good. Tomorrow morning, I walk back into Diner 47. No disguise, no hat, no limp. I want everyone there when the truth comes out." He hung up, sat back in his chair, and allowed himself one deep breath. Tomorrow would not just be a confrontation. It would be a reckoning. And when the reckoning came, it would not just end with Rick Wallace and his nephew. It would begin a new standard for Harbor Eats, one that no one could erase again. The silent storm had gathered strength, and now it was ready to break. Friday morning came sharp and cold, the air outside Harbor Point Diner number 47 buzzing with the noise of commuters and the smell of frying bacon drifting out onto the street. But inside that diner, the stage was set for a reckoning no one expected. At 9 o'clock sharp, the door opened, and this time there was no faded work shirt, no stitched name tag, no attempt to blend in. Because David Carter walked in wearing a dark charcoal suit, the same suit he had worn years earlier when he cut the ribbon on the company's 50th location. His posture straight, his face unreadable. And beside him walked Mara Lynn, head of investigations, holding a tablet glowing with the live audit data. And as the bell above the door jingled, conversation in the diner stuttered and fell into silence. Rick Wallace froze mid-sentence, leaning against the counter, his smile curdling as he recognized the man he thought would never set foot in his branch unannounced. And Ethan's hands slowed above the POS screen, his smirk fading as he realized the storm he had laughed at all week had finally arrived. Even Chase, who had been lazily pouring coffee into a mug, stopped mid-motion, eyes wide, the carafe tilting in his grip. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Good morning," he said. His words calm. Too calm. "I won't take much of your time. Just the last 15 years I've spent building this company." He stepped forward, placed his hand firmly on the counter, the weight of it silencing even the hiss of the coffee machine, and locked eyes with Rick. "I once told my managers that fairness is not a slogan. It is a behavior repeated every day. But here," his voice sharpened, "someone rewrote the rules." He turned slightly to Mara, who tapped her tablet, and instantly graphs bloomed across the screen, mirrored on the diner's small customer-facing display so everyone could see. Red lines, green bars, names and numbers spilling out in plain sight. One chart showed tip distribution for the month. Monica James with 10% despite serving nearly 40% of tables. Angela Torres with 3% despite logging 50 shifts. While Ethan Wallace's name towered over the chart with 68% of tips, though his ticket count proved he had served barely 1 in 5 tables. Another chart showed unauthorized role assignments, 3 hidden accounts marked Preferred Internal, a tier never meant to exist, all traced to Rick's manager login, and the third, the most damning, traced payments from ghost employees like Marcus Hill straight into Douglas Henderson LLC, the shell company Rick himself had created. Gasps rose from customers, employees shifted nervously, and Monica, tray in hand, stopped moving for the first time all morning, her back straightening, her eyes locking on the screen. The truth she had carried in her secret notebook now displayed for all to see. Ethan tried to speak, his voice high and defensive. "That's not." But David cut him off with a single glance, the kind of look that told him there would be no more hiding, no more laughing. "You received 68% of tips this month," David said flatly. "Not because you worked harder, not because you served more tables, but because someone gave you keys to a door that others were never told existed." The room held its breath. Monica set her tray down, stood a little taller. Angela leaned against the counter, her face pale but her eyes alive with vindication. From the kitchen, Marcus Green stepped forward, arms folded, a quiet pillar of solidarity. And Rick, finally breaking his silence, cleared his throat and said, "Sir, with respect, you don't understand how busy mornings run. Sometimes adjustments have to be made. It's just—" David slammed his palm on the counter, not in rage, but in finality. "Do not insult me with excuses. I built this company dish by dish, table by table, and I know the difference between a mistake and a system rigged for theft." His voice was calm, but the steel in it cut deeper than shouting ever could. Rick's face flushed, his polished composure cracking. Ethan looked to him for rescue, but none came. Mara's tablet pinged again. Another update. Live distribution of tips as of that very moment. Ethan already logging 2 new overrides since David had walked in. Proof of arrogance even under scrutiny. David pointed at the screen. "Even now, while standing here in front of me, you still try to rewrite the system." A heavy silence fell, the kind of silence that only comes when lies collapse under their own weight. Monica exhaled slowly, her shoulders releasing years of quiet tension, and Angela reached out to touch her arm in solidarity. Customers whispered, some pulling out their phones, recording the moment. The atmosphere no longer just about breakfast, but about justice. David turned his gaze back to Rick. "Effective immediately. You are suspended. Your records will be handed to legal. Ethan, you too. There is no room here for anyone who takes transparency and turns it into a personal hustle." Rick opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Mara tapped the screen again. And his ghost payroll, his fake employees, his shell company payouts glowed in undeniable detail. There was no room left for words. Rick looked at Ethan, and for the first time, fear passed between them. Ethan fumbled, pulling his access card from his pocket, laying it reluctantly on the counter. Rick followed, his shoulders sagging, the sharpness gone from his eyes. David didn't take the cards. He placed them flat on the counter for everyone to see. "These do not belong to you anymore," he said. Then he turned to the staff, scanning each face, not for guilt, but for something else, for recognition. "If you've done the work, you will be seen and you will be paid. But if you hide behind smiles and loopholes, you will be removed, no matter how long you've stood at the register." No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was heavier, sacred almost. The silence of truth spoken aloud after too long in the dark. Monica's eyes met David's, and in that instant she knew she was no longer alone. The storm had broken, and the reckoning had begun. Friday morning came sharp and cold, the air outside Harbor Point Diner number 47 buzzing with the noise of commuters and the smell of frying bacon drifting out onto the street. But inside that diner, the stage was set for a reckoning no one expected. At 9 o'clock sharp, the door opened, and this time there was no faded work shirt, no stitched name tag, no attempt to blend in, because David Carter walked in wearing a dark charcoal suit, the same suit he had worn years earlier when he cut the ribbon on the company's 50th location. His posture straight, his face unreadable, and beside him walked Mara Lynn, head of investigations, holding a tablet glowing with the live audit data. And as the bell above the door jingled, conversation in the diner stuttered and fell into silence. Rick Wallace froze mid-sentence, leaning against the counter, his smile curdling as he recognized the man he thought would never set foot in his branch unannounced. And Ethan's hand slowed above the POS screen, his smirk fading as he realized the storm he had laughed at all week had finally arrived. Even Chase, who had been lazily pouring coffee into a mug, stopped mid-motion, eyes wide, the carafe tilting in his grip. David didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Good morning," he said, his words calm, too calm. "I won't take much of your time, just the last 15 years I've spent building this company." He stepped forward, placed his hand firmly on the counter, the weight of it silencing even the hiss of the coffee machine, and locked eyes with Rick. "I once told my managers that fairness is not a slogan. It is a behavior repeated every day. But here," his voice sharpened, "someone rewrote the rules." He turned slightly to Mara, who tapped her tablet, and instantly graphs bloomed across the screen, mirrored on the diner's small customer-facing display so everyone could see. Red lines, green bars, names and numbers spilling out in plain sight. One chart showed tip distribution for the month, Monica James with 10% despite serving nearly 40% of tables, Angela Torres with 3% despite logging 50 shifts, while Ethan Wallace's name towered over the chart with 68% of tips, though his ticket count proved he had served barely 1 in 5 tables. Another chart showed unauthorized role assignments, 3 hidden accounts marked Preferred Internal, a tier never meant to exist, all traced to Rick's manager login, and the third, the most damning, traced payments from ghost employees like Marcus Hill straight into Douglas Henderson LLC, the shell company Rick himself had created. Gasps rose from customers, employees shifted nervously, and Monica, tray in hand, stopped moving for the first time all morning, her back straightening, her eyes locking on the screen. The truth she had carried in her secret notebook now displayed for all to see. Ethan tried to speak, his voice high and defensive. "That's not." But David cut him off with a single glance, the kind of look that told him there would be no more hiding, no more laughing. "You received 68% of tips this month," David said flatly. "Not because you worked harder, not because you served more tables. but because someone gave you keys to a door that others were never told existed. The room held its breath. Monica set her tray down, stood a little taller. Angela leaned against the counter, her face pale but her eyes alive with vindication. From the kitchen, Marcus Green stepped forward, arms folded, a quiet pillar of solidarity, and Rick, finally breaking his silence, cleared his throat and said, "Sir, with respect, you don't understand how busy mornings run. Sometimes adjustments have to be made. It's just—" David slammed his palm on the counter, not in rage, but in finality. "Do not insult me with excuses. I built this company dish by dish, table by table, and I know the difference between a mistake and a system rigged for theft." His voice was calm, but the steel in it cut deeper than shouting ever could. Rick's face flushed, his polished composure cracking. Ethan looked to him for rescue, but none came. Mara's tablet pinged again. Another update. Live distribution of tips as of that very moment. Ethan already logging 2 new overrides since David had walked in. Proof of arrogance even under scrutiny. David pointed at the screen. "Even now, while standing here in front of me, you still try to rewrite the system." A heavy silence fell, the kind of silence that only comes when lies collapse under their own weight. Monica exhaled slowly, her shoulders releasing years of quiet tension, and Angela reached out to touch her arm in solidarity. Customers whispered, some pulling out their phones, recording the moment. The atmosphere no longer just about breakfast, but about justice. David turned his gaze back to Rick. "Effective immediately. You are suspended. Your records will be handed to legal. Ethan, you too. There is no room here for anyone who takes transparency and turns it into a personal hustle." Rick opened his mouth to protest, but before he could speak, Mara tapped the screen again. And his ghost payroll, his fake employees, his shell company payouts glowed in undeniable detail. There was no room left for words. Rick looked at Ethan, and for the first time, fear passed between them. Ethan fumbled, pulling his access card from his pocket, laying it reluctantly on the counter. Rick followed, his shoulders sagging, the sharpness gone from his eyes. David didn't take the cards. He placed them flat on the counter for everyone to see. "These do not belong to you anymore," he said. Then he turned to the staff, scanning each face, not for guilt, but for something else, for recognition. "If you've done the work, you will be seen, and you will be paid. But if you hide behind smiles and loopholes, you will be removed, no matter how long you've stood at the register." No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was heavier, sacred almost. The silence of truth spoken aloud after too long in the dark. Monica's eyes met David's, and in that instant, she knew she was no longer alone. The storm had broken, and the reckoning had begun. The diner was frozen in silence after David Carter laid down the cards on the counter, his words still hanging in the air, and for a few long seconds it felt like time itself had stopped. But then, Rick Wallace, his polished facade cracking, straightened his shoulders and tried to recover, his voice loud, desperate, pitched high enough for the customers to hear. "This is a misunderstanding. Sir, these numbers can be explained. Adjustments are made all the time in busy restaurants. You can't just walk in here and accuse me in front of my staff, in front of customers. This is slander." But the more he spoke, the more the words rang hollow. Because Mara Lynn tapped the tablet again, and a new chart appeared, glowing in red, showing transfers from ghost employee Marcus Hill's account to Douglas Henderson LLC every Friday morning for the past 3 months. Amounts so precise they matched the exact shortfall Monica had recorded in her notebook, and the whispers in the room grew louder, customers shifting in their seats, phones raised higher to capture every second. Rick's voice wavered. He tried again. "That account is a legitimate vendor. We use consultants for staffing. It's not unusual. But David cut him off with a calmness that chilled the room. Stop. Every single transfer ties back to an email address you used before this promotion. You wrote this system into existence. You built it to hide theft behind configuration. I don't need excuses. I have proof. Rick's face drained of color. And beside him, Ethan Wallace finally snapped, his arrogance twisting into anger. You don't get it, Ethan spat. I do the hardest work here. I deserve those tips. Without me, the register would collapse. Without me, none of them know how to handle the system. His voice rose, sharp, defensive. But the staff's faces told a different story. Monica standing tall, Angela glaring at him with quiet fury. Marcus Green stepping out from the kitchen, wiping his hands on his apron as if preparing for more than cooking. And even Chase, who had spent months leaning against the wall in silence, now staring at Ethan as though finally realizing how much he had been complicit in. Ethan saw the shift in the room and shouted louder. Don't act like you care, Monica. You've always been sloppy. You don't know how to run a floor. I deserve more because I'm smarter. His words hung in the air, cruel and cutting. But instead of breaking her, they only made her straighten her back further, her eyes locking on him with a calm that burned hotter than fire. You don't deserve what you never worked for, she said quietly, her voice trembling not from fear, but from strength. Customers gasped, some murmured agreement, and a few clapped softly, not in applause but in recognition. David let the silence linger, then said evenly, You think being clever makes you untouchable, Ethan, but cleverness built on fraud is nothing but sand, and today the tide has come in. Mara's tablet chimed again. Another live update, and she held it up for the staff and customers to see. The system had already been reset to the new audit protocol, and Ethan's name had vanished from the tip distribution screen, his access revoked in real time. He lunged toward the counter, grabbing at the POS screen, but the system denied him, locked him out permanently, and the look on his face was pure disbelief, like a man watching a kingdom crumble beneath his feet. Rick reached out to steady him, but before he could whisper a word, the door of the diner opened, and two men in dark suits stepped inside. Accompanied by a uniformed officer, the room shifted instantly, the customers leaning forward, cameras trembling in their hands. David didn't flinch. He simply nodded at the men. You're right on time. They were investigators from the Federal Labor Fraud Division, already briefed by Mara in the background of the silent audit. The officer stepped forward, calm but firm. Richard Wallace, you're being detained for questioning regarding financial fraud and payroll manipulation. Gasps erupted, and Rick's face twisted with shock, his voice breaking. This can't be happening. Not here, not in front of them. We can settle this quietly. But the officer was already placing him in handcuffs, his polished shirt wrinkling under the metal. Ethan backed away, shaking his head, panic rising in his voice. No, I didn't do anything. I was just following Rick's orders. But Mara's tablet showed his fingerprint logins, his overrides, his fake entries, every action tied directly to his name. You weren't following orders, David said softly. You were enjoying the power, mocking the people you stole from. That ends today. Ethan tried to run, but Marcus Green, silent no longer, stepped forward and blocked him, one hand on his shoulder, the other pointing him back toward the officers. You've stolen enough from us, Marcus said, his deep voice steady. Now you pay it back. The customers erupted, some cheering, some clapping, phones capturing every angle as Ethan was led toward the door, his protests growing weaker by the step. Rick followed, silent now, head bowed, the weight of years of lies pressing down. And when the door closed behind them, the diner seemed to breathe for the first time in years. David turned to the staff, his voice low but firm. This ends today. No more invisible roles, no more hidden accounts. From now on, whoever serves is seen, whoever works is paid. That's the standard, nothing less. The staff stood in stunned silence. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, relief began to show on their faces. Angela wiped a tear from her eye. Monica's hands finally stopped trembling, and Marcus folded his arms, nodding quietly. Customers rose to leave, some stopping to thank Monica, some shaking David's hand, and more than a few promising to share what they had just witnessed. Outside, sirens faded, and inside, the air was different, lighter, as if the weight of years of silent theft had finally been lifted. David glanced at Monica. Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange they both understood. This was not the end, but the beginning of something larger, a change that would spread beyond this single diner, a reset that could ripple across the entire company. For now, though, the reckoning had landed, and the collapse of Rick Wallace's scheme was complete, not hidden in back offices or quiet memos, but in the full light of morning, with every witness watching. The arrest of Rick and Ethan Wallace did not end when the diner door shut behind them. It was only the first ripple of a tidal wave that spread through Harbor Eats and beyond, because by the next morning, video clips from customers had gone viral. Hashtags like Harbor Fraud and Justice for Workers trended across social media, millions of views piling up in hours, and the company's name was suddenly on every local news broadcast. David Carter sat in his Baltimore office watching the coverage, his face calm but his mind racing, because he knew the moment demanded more than outrage. It demanded transformation. He called an emergency board meeting that same afternoon, the directors startled by the speed of events. Some worried about reputation damage, others already whispering about shareholder confidence. But David shut them down with a single sentence. We don't save this company by denying what happened. We save it by proving it will never happen again. He presented Mara Lynn's full audit, not just for Diner 47, but for 3 other locations where hidden accounts had also been uncovered. More than $50,000 stolen in 1 quarter alone. Some directors gasped, some lowered their heads, but no one argued with the evidence. David laid out his plan. Immediate restructuring of the POS system to eliminate hidden roles. Installation of a transparent tip-sharing dashboard visible to every employee. And the creation of an independent fairness committee reporting directly to him, with employee representatives like Monica James included at the table. If you serve, he said firmly, you are seen, and you are credited, no exceptions. The board approved unanimously, knowing the world was watching. Meanwhile, Rick Wallace sat in a holding cell, his lawyer scrambling, but the case against him grew heavier by the hour. Federal investigators tracing not only the ghost payroll and shell company payouts, but also years of quiet tax evasion tied to his scheme. And though he pled for leniency, the evidence pointed to prison, 7 years minimum for financial fraud and theft of wages. Ethan, released on bail, found himself unemployable, his name trending online as a symbol of nepotism and arrogance, his former friends abandoning him, his future collapsing under the weight of exposure. Back at the diner, the mood had shifted dramatically. Customers returned not just for pancakes and coffee, but to see change in motion, watching with curiosity as the new system rolled out. A digital screen mounted near the register now displaying tip distribution live. Every card tip instantly credited to the server who earned it. No loopholes, no shadows. For the first time, Angela Torres saw her name appear on the screen after a shift, a modest $8 from her morning tables. But her eyes filled with tears, because it was hers, clear and undeniable. Marcus Green, silent for years, finally spoke openly at a staff meeting, thanking David for not looking away, his deep voice steady as he said, "We've been carrying this place too long in silence. Now we can breathe." But the loudest change came from Monica James, who once hid her notebook in fear, but now stood at the center of reform. David called her into his office, the same office where years of executive decisions had been made, and handed her a folder. Inside was her new role, Regional Training Manager for Transparency, tasked with traveling branch to branch to teach employees how to use the new system, how to document fairly, how to ensure no one would ever again feel invisible. Monica stared at the offer, tears streaming down her face, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I don't know if I'm ready for this." David leaned forward, his tone gentle but firm. "You've been ready for years. You're the reason we're here." She accepted, and in the weeks that followed, her story spread across the company like a quiet anthem. At Diner 17, a part-timer returned after quitting months earlier, saying simply, "I heard the system changed. I want to try again." At Diner 42, a new hire named Nena wrote Monica a message. "The first day I saw my name on the tip screen, I cried. I didn't know I was allowed to exist." At headquarters, the end-of-month employee survey showed something David had never seen before. Turnover down 18% across the system. But more than that, a new question on the feedback form, added quietly by Mara, asked, "Do you feel seen at work?" And for the first time in years, the majority answered yes. Meanwhile, the broader world took notice. Labor rights groups praised Harbor Eats for acting swiftly. News outlets ran segments calling it a model for transparency in the service industry, and competitors began quietly inquiring about licensing the technology. David refused to sell, insisting instead that fairness was not a commodity, but a standard, and he announced the launch of the Harbor Promise, a fund dedicated to compensating workers at every branch where fraud had been uncovered. Using seized assets from Rick's scheme as the seed capital, the message was clear: what was stolen would be restored. In Baltimore, customers left larger tips than ever, not out of pity, but out of trust, because they knew now the right hands would receive them. The diner, once heavy with silence, now hummed with energy, staff walking taller, smiles real rather than forced. The weight of secrecy lifted. Still, David knew the battle wasn't only external. He called another meeting with regional managers, staring each of them in the eye as he said, "If you are here to exploit, leave now. If you are here to serve, stay and rebuild with me." Not a single manager left the room, but every one of them shifted uneasily. Aware that the era of looking away was over, Rick Wallace's trial loomed. Ethan's name became a case study in training seminars, and Harbor Eats began to transform, not in slogans, not in commercials, but in the small daily proof that fairness had returned to the floor. Monica, once a waitress wiping her eyes between tables, now stood in front of groups of employees at new branches, holding up her old notebook and telling them, "I wrote this down because I thought no one would believe me. You don't have to do that anymore. Now the system writes it for you." And every time she said it, she saw heads nod, tears glisten, shoulders straighten. That was the true reform. Not just technology, but belief. David watched from the sidelines, not needing applause, only needing to know that his company was once again aligned with the promise he had made when he started with nothing, that the people who worked hardest would never be invisible. The aftershocks of the collapse had become the foundation of something new, and Harbor Eats stood not weaker but stronger, forged in fire, rebuilt in light. 8 months later, the memory of that Friday morning at Harbor Point Diner still lived in whispers, in boardrooms, in break rooms, in the daily rhythm of servers carrying trays with a confidence they had not felt in years. Because what began in Baltimore had become a movement that spread across all 120 Harbor Eats locations. And the company, once scarred by hidden theft and silent exploitation, now stood as a national example of fairness restored. Rick Wallace was no longer a manager but an inmate, convicted of financial fraud and wage theft, sentenced to 7 years in federal prison, his polished shirts and practiced charm stripped away. His name now a cautionary tale in the industry. Ethan Wallace, once arrogant at the register, was barred permanently from working in food service, his name circulating in case studies for ethics seminars, a reminder that entitlement without work collapses quickly under the light of truth. Their downfall was not celebrated with cruelty, but remembered as proof that the system had changed, that the days of silence had ended. In contrast, Monica James's life had transformed beyond what she once thought possible. The woman who once hid her notebook in her apron, scribbling numbers to prove she wasn't crazy, now carried that same notebook like a relic, holding it up at training sessions across the country as she told new employees, "I don't need this anymore, but I keep it to remind myself that silence can break you, and courage can change everything." Her role as regional training manager had grown, and now she oversaw transparency rollouts in every branch, employees clapping softly when they saw their names appear instantly on digital screens after serving tables, some tearing up quietly, the relief visible in their eyes. David Carter watched it all unfold, not with pride that sought recognition, but with quiet satisfaction, because the numbers told one story. Turnover down 30% across the system, employee satisfaction surveys climbing higher than ever, customers praising Harbor Eats not only for food, but for fairness. But the true story was in the people, in the way Angela Torres, once a nervous trainee blocked at the register, now stood confidently as a floor supervisor, in the way Marcus Green, who had cooked silently for years, finally applied for a leadership program funded by the Harbor Promise, in the way messages poured into headquarters from staff who finally felt seen. David received one letter that stayed with him, written in careful handwriting by a part-time worker in Ohio. "For the first time in my life, I feel like my work matters. Thank you for not looking away." He folded it gently, placed it in his desk drawer, and kept it there as a reminder. The world outside Harbor Eats had taken notice, too. Other restaurant chains began adopting similar transparency dashboards. Unions praised the reforms. Labor organizations cited Harbor Eats as a model. And while competitors scrambled to catch up, David did not see it as rivalry. He saw it as legacy. "Fairness," he told a conference audience, "is not a competitive advantage. It is a responsibility." That line was replayed on the evening news, quoted in business journals. But for David, the meaning was personal. He still remembered Monica's words in that booth, the pain in her whisper, "What hurts more is no one ever asked." And so he built a culture where asking was mandatory, where listening was a practice, not a slogan. On a quiet morning in Baltimore, nearly identical to the one when it all began, David returned to Diner 47. He walked in, not undercover this time, not in a suit either, just as himself, and sat in the same corner booth where Monica had once laid down her secret notebook. A waitress, new and smiling, brought him coffee, and without hesitation the screen above the counter pinged, instantly logging her name and the tip attached. She glanced up, smiled wider, and David nodded to himself. That was the real victory, not the numbers, not the headlines, but the small, everyday moment where a worker knew she was seen. Before leaving, he wrote a short note on the receipt, folded it beneath the tip. "Fairness lives when people like you keep showing up." He walked out into the daylight, the city alive around him. The storm that had once shaken Harbor Eats now settled into something steadier, stronger, and as he paused at the curb, he thought not of Rick or Ethan, not even of the viral videos or the courtroom headlines, but of Monica James, the young woman who chose not to stay silent, who picked up a pen and wrote the truth when no one else dared. And in her courage, he found the spark to rebuild his company's soul. Legacy, he realized, is not built in boardrooms or on balance sheets. It is built in the quiet choices of ordinary people who refuse to look away. And for David Carter, for Harbor Eats, and for every worker who now saw their name on the screen after a shift. That was the dawn of something new, something worth protecting, something finally fair. Thank you for listening to this story. Don't forget to subscribe for more, and give this video a like so more people can hear it. Your support means the world.